Welcome to Every Brain Matters podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? I am your host, Corinne Gasper, the director of Jennifer's Messengers, an organization that sounds the alarm on marijuana-impaired driving. Jennifer was my beautiful daughter who was killed by a medical marijuana-impaired driver in the prime of her life. She was just 22. Okay, Dr. Eustis, would you like to take a moment, introduce yourself, and give us a brief history of how you've come here today?
I am happy to do that. I retired recently from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institutes of Health, where I conducted controlled drug administration studies for more than 23 years. I am currently a senior fellow at the Institute on Emerging Health Professions, Thomas Jefferson University, and also senior scientific advisor to PinneyAssociates and president of Huestis and Smith Toxicology. My research program that continues on is in discovering the mechanisms of action of cannabinoid agonists and antagonists, effects of in utero drug exposure, oral fluid testing, driving under the influence of drugs, and the neurobiology and pharmacokinetics of novel psychoactive substances. I've published 529 manuscripts about these topics, and I received an honorary doctoral degree in Faculty of Medicine, University of Helsinki, and many other very important awards. The journal Clinical Chemistry featured me as an inspiring mind. I'm on the World Anti-Doping Agency's Prohibited Drug List Committee, the National Safety Council's Alcohol, Drugs, and Impairment Division, and many other organizations. I am a past president of the Society of Forensic Toxicologists, past chair of the Toxicology Section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and past president of the International Association of Forensic Toxicologists. And I need to tell your viewers that this is not my typical voice, that I do have a bad cold. I'm hoping it's not COVID, but I am very passionate about this topic and really want to discuss it with you today.
Wow, that's amazing. And we are just so happy to have you here today. And your background is so perfect for what we're going to talk about today. A lot of people don't understand, and they've heard things like, I actually drive better when I'm high. So it'd be nice to talk about this and how that could be virtually impossible. You know, I know that you prefer to call marijuana, which we out in the world call, but the medical terminology I'm thinking is cannabis. Is that correct? Is there any difference?
Well, it's very important to use cannabis. It is the scientific appropriate word because marijuana is only one form of cannabis. It's the leaf material, but there are extracts and isolates, and there are, cannabis products that are gummy bears and sodas and everything else now. So cannabis covers all of the material that include THC. And THC is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. So cannabis is a better word, but we're referring to marijuana and all of the forms, including edibles and dabbing and other ways in which people use it.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because I know a lot of people get confused about that. And I know the marijuana industry likes to refer to it in different ways for different reasons. So now we know why. Can you tell us a little bit about the study on marijuana-impaired driving that you did, or cannabis and impaired driving?
Yes, I wanted very much to run that study. The United States has the most advanced driving simulator in the world. And it was built by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, at the University of Iowa. And the University of Iowa now maintains it and has a whole staff of engineers, physicians. It takes a lot of people to run this instrument. And we've had it, but it had never been used to test drugs. It was used for very useful things like pharmaceutical companies to make sure drugs were not making people drowsy or impaired. It was used for all of the distracted driving, like with your cell phones and texting. But I felt strongly that we needed to test cannabis. I tried for 10 years, and every year I was in there telling the Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, I need to do this study. We need this information. As more and more cannabis use comes on, we need to be able to describe. And also, the most common combination is cannabis and alcohol. So I wanted to do alcohol alone and alcohol with cannabis. So there was actually 6 different driving scenarios for 45 minutes so that we had a complete coverage of placebo, cannabis with active alcohol, active cannabis, 2 different doses with placebo, alcohol, and placebo both. So 6 sessions. And after 10 years, ONDCP said, go run that study. Here's the money and leave us alone. So I was thrilled. And the study cost about $2 million to do.
Wow.
And so both the ONDCP, NHTSA, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse all supported the study. And in this study, we evaluated many different aspects of cannabis impaired driving. Cannabis is known to cause you to weave in your lane. This is one of the most common things that happen, is that you lose that control to stay within your lane. And many of the accidents that occur, in fact, we should never use the word accident when someone chooses to use a drug. It's a crash. And it's a decision that they make to use the drug and drive. So it's never an accident. So the person will drift across the lane and hit the oncoming car head on, or they may drift off the road and hit trees, signs, and things like this. They also, so that's their lateral movement that they lose control on. They also lose control of their longitudinal movement. So they have more variability in their speed. They're not quite sure about the distance between the car in front of them. So those are 2 of the aspects. But one of the things that's so important for people to understand, and excuse me a moment, I'll take a sip.
Absolutely. Take your time.
One of the critical things is for people to understand that we all have an endogenous cannabinoid system in our brain, and it's been conserved over evolution. And this system is so important. It is in charge of things like survival mechanisms, body temperature, reproduction, hunger, memory, attention, divided attention, all these aspects that we need in order to survive. And the endogenous neurotransmitter system actually maintains what we call homeostasis. It tries to keep things in balance.
Yes.
So there are specific areas of the brain that have a large number of cannabinoid receptor 1. There are more than one type of cannabinoid receptor, but it turns out that the cannabinoid CB1 receptor is of highest density in most parts of our brain. So there are specific areas like the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, which are the areas in charge of motion, fine motor control. They are tremendously affected by cannabis. This is where you'll hear of crashes where the driver on cannabis runs into the back of a police car, because they just can't control their motor impulses well. The biggest area is decision making. So the area, the hippocampus of the brain, the area of memory, decision making, the huge brain that we have, that's the difference between us and lower animals. Right. That huge brain is our executive function. And executive function is taking in all the information from your environment, first evaluating it. Is it important or salient? If it's important, I'm going to pay attention to it. Then I need to compare it to what's in my memory. And then I need to make decisions on what course of action I'm going to take. And cannabis slows every one of those steps to executive function. And so many, many times, the cannabis causes an individual to have a crash because they cannot respond to their environment and changes in their environment. A good example is a child coming out of a side street on a bicycle and into traffic. Surely the individual has no intention of hurting that child, but they may see the child a little bit later. It takes them longer to realize it's important. It takes them longer to consider, what can I do to avoid the crash? What can I do to implement this action? And so cannabis really impairs driving.
Take a drink there. Somebody mentioned something to me because, of course, the man that did this to my daughter went through a red light and he was traveling at a high rate of speed. Somebody said that it actually causes a tunneling. It affects the visual senses too, and it causes a tunneling effect. So he probably didn't even see there was a light there. Have you found this? Is this something that...
There is one paper that talks about tunneling of peripheral vision.
Yes.
But there's only one. So it's something I also have heard about, but there's not a lot of strong evidence. I would say more common would be that executive function.
Yes.
The ability to recognize like a light changing.
Yes.
Or even to recognize that the light is there,
yes,
and that they need to stop.
Yes.
I'd like to also bring another thing up. In the kinds of studies that we can do as researchers, we are limited in the amount of drug that we can give someone, yes, and for the amount of time that we can give them. And it's very interesting because at the doses that we can give, usually we see a slowing of speed, and that is not what you see in the cannabis impaired arrests and what you see in the cannabis crashes. So it appears that individuals who take a lot more drug than we can safely give do end up increasing their speed. And that's another issue because the faster you're going, the harder it is for you to respond appropriately when there's a change. In my study, initially I had people driving, and it's a long drive, so that we captured many different aspects of driving. But we told them to go straight, and when they saw the light by the Shell station, to turn left. And every single person that was on cannabis drove right through the light.
Oh my gosh.
So we actually had to change. We had to change the whole program because obviously the study went on to the left and they went straight. So it's people, I have many parents that tell me, oh, I'm so glad my son Jimmy is not drinking and driving.
Yeah.
He's just smoking marijuana and driving. And it shows such a lack of education.
Yes.
It's true that alcohol is the number one cause of crashes and motor vehicle deaths. But cannabis is number two. And cannabis about doubles the odds ratio of having a serious motor vehicle crash. Plus, and so when parents don't understand that,
right.
Not educating our children.
Plus, we know right from the authorities that once they find enough alcohol to convict, that they do not go on and test for drugs. So a lot of these statistics that we have and we're gauging this upon are somewhat skewed because there probably is marijuana involved in a lot of these that are arrested for alcohol.
You are absolutely right. And it is directly because we have not funded our forensic laboratories well enough that the cost to do the blood testing, we don't have enough people, enough equipment,
right,
etc.
I hear that they're very backed up as well. The labs get very backed up.
It's absolutely true. And we also need to change our laws because our laws in many states, not all, but in many states say that there's no difference whether you drink alcohol and use all the drugs in the world.
Yes.
It's the same penalty. So we need to make sure that we have laws that penalize people who drink and drive and who use drugs and drive.
Yes, in fact, Ed Wood got a law passed in Colorado that helped with defining those statistics better, and it's helped with the laws as well that follow, and it keeps all of us safer.
That is absolutely true.
Yeah,
absolutely true. The other thing I want to say is how the perception of any risk has occurred for young people, because they used to say cannabis is an illegal drug. I don't want to get in trouble. Cannabis can affect me in many ways. Now they say cannabis can't be bad for me. They've made it legal. Cannabis can't be bad for me. It's medicine.
To what you're saying, Dr. Eustis, our DA in our county has found that these people that are that do get arrested for impaired driving, they are surprised that, well, I have this medical marijuana card from my doctor, but they have not, been told, or it hasn't been explained to them that doesn't, this is an impairing medicine. There's no warning labels, so they just assume, well, doctor gave this to me, I can drive. And so we've got a lot of things to clear up here.
Absolutely. And I must say, you have a lot of money behind the cannabis industry.
Yes.
And there's lots of publicity, and our governments have not done a good job, our schools, of educating people about the harms of cannabis. And I hope maybe we'll have another conversation one day, because my biggest concerns about cannabis is, number one, the short-term effect on cannabis impaired driving and the increase in morbidity and mortality. But my second huge concern is the long-term concern of the effect of cannabis on the developing brain. Mm-hmm. And it affects in utero exposure, babies that are breastfed from moms who are using cannabis, babies that are breathing it in passive inhalation, and then obviously when they start self-administering as adolescents, it completely affects the development of their brain.
Well, we'll definitely have you back when we do our podcast on that. There was another thing that really concerned me that I think a lot of people do not understand, and that is chronic use. And so, okay, I haven't used in a couple days. Today I might have had some alcohol, and I'm out on the road. Does that cannabis from a couple days ago being a chronic user, still have an effect on me a couple days later, even though I haven't
Yes.
used that particular time.
Yes. And I think I want to say whether the alcohol is in the picture or not. I like to think that I spent the first half of my career studying acute cannabis use by different routes of exposure, different potencies, et cetera. But I couldn't figure out how to study chronic frequent cannabis use because of what I said before. We are limited in how much we will give people for safety and ethical and even financial reasons. So I finally figured out.
Let me just ask you something, because you mentioned that twice, and I didn't mean to cut you off there. But so what in your testing, what are you allowed to give? And what do you think typically is used outside, just so people can compare the difference there?
Well, so it's kind of a long conversation, but we'll try to make it a little short. No, so what we have to do is do no harm first. We can't give anything that is going to harm the individual. So we only give drug to people who already take the drug. We only give drug as much as they give themselves, like in a single setting kind of thing. And we do it with doctors and nurses, and we have crash carts, and we have medicines in case they have, get faint, or they have any kind of medical emergency we are prepared for. But with chronic use, people take huge amounts of the drug every day of the year. So what I started to do, and when we also are somewhat limited in the potency that we can give, but individuals titrate their dose. If you're smoking or you're vaporizing cannabis, you can titrate your dose, which means you can take in as much of the drug as you can get based on how you smoke it. So the people that are used to smoking the drug a lot, they will inhale very deeply. They will hold it in the lungs, deep in the lungs, and they will get very high concentrations. So I can get the same high concentrations that the users are getting out in the field. But what I don't do is give them 20, 30, 40 joints a day, every day for 10 years. That's what I mean about the limitation.
Okay.
So in this study, I wanted so much to study the effects of chronic frequent cannabis use. And so what we did is I took the individuals from many of my studies who use the most cannabis. I brought them in at 9 or 10 o'clock at night because I wanted them not to be acutely impaired in the morning, but I didn't want them to start going through cannabis withdrawal. And when you are a chronic frequent cannabis smoker, you develop some tolerance and you develop cannabis dependence.
Right.
And when you don't get the drug, you start to have cannabis withdrawal, all of which are recognized psychiatric diagnoses now. So they came in at 10 o'clock. They had no drug all night. I did all my baseline measures. So I had a non-acutely intoxicated person. And then we didn't give them drug. We kept them on a closed research unit for up to 30 days.
Wow.
Remember, they're volunteers. They can leave anytime they want.
Yes.
So it was extremely difficult. We started with about 30 people, and it was such an amazing study. We went down and we imaged the density of the CB1 cannabinoid receptors in different areas of their brain, many different areas of their brain. And it was one of the first objective measures showing the long-term effects of chronic cannabis exposure. And so I told you already all the important functions that the endogenous cannabinoid system is involved in. And what we showed was significant downregulation of the cannabinoid receptor density in the anterior cingulate, in the insula, in many different areas of the brain, the areas that are in charge of movement, in charge of memory, in charge of attention. So we showed this significant change. And if you have reduced the receptors, then your brain is not functioning appropriately. So we showed that initially. We also took blood every day, and we showed that before this study, every toxicologist around the world would have said, if you find THC in the blood, then that individual used recently within 6 hours, at the most 12 hours prior. And if they're an occasional user, like 2 hours prior. Unbelievably, we were able to measure THC in the blood of some chronic frequent cannabis users for the full 30 days.
Wow. So it was leaching from the fat tissue in the body into the blood.
Yes. And guess what? One of the tissues in the body that has the most fat? The brain. Also, there's a study from France that shows that the THC stays in the brain longer than it stays in the blood. And so if we're still measuring it in the blood, it's still in the brain. And it's the active compound that's in the brain. So the third piece of the puzzle, so we showed the receptors in the brain, we showed THC in the blood. The third piece was we brought over from the Netherlands, where they do the studies in the cars that they put out on the regular highway. Jan Ramakers is a good friend and colleague. He has shown that divided attention and tracking are two of the primary effects of cannabis on driving. And he showed it in the lab, and he showed it on the street in the car. We brought over a graduate student and all his equipment, and we ran it in this study, and the results were shocking. So we showed impairment between occasional users and chronic frequent users, so that the chronic frequent users performed worse than the occasional users when everybody's sober. Then we showed the chronic frequent cannabis users were impaired after 1 week of abstinence, 2 weeks of abstinence, 3 weeks of no cannabis. They still were significantly impaired compared to the controls.
Yeah.
Amazing. So the fact that they still have the drug in the brain and it's active, it's still going to affect their driving.
Right. Right. Wow. So anybody that says that driving under the influence of marijuana is safe could not know any of this and doesn't really understand cannabis whatsoever.
Well, it's they don't want to understand it.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And you know, the other area that I want to say really occurs with cannabis crashes is the unexpected event. People may smoke cannabis and drive home just fine 8 times in a row. Okay. They go down the road, nothing unusual happens. They make it home. But the next time they go out, you know, somebody opens a car door into traffic in a city. Somebody misses, you know, they've been waiting to turn left, and finally they get the light turning yellow or red, and they turn. They cannot compensate for that. And I will tell you a true story. teenagers are driving down the road. They've been smoking marijuana in the car, and the teenager is going through the main street of the town, and he sees way down the road, he sees an old man crossing the street, and he calculates, like we all do.
Yes.
Okay, he's already halfway across. I'm going slow. By the time he gets there, I get there, he's going to be across the street. But the old man drops his keys.
Oh my.
And he's leaning over, and he's trying so hard to pick him up, and he can't pick him up. And the kid driving, he doesn't see it as quickly as he should. He doesn't assess the meaning, the criticalness of this. He doesn't decide what he's going to do, and he doesn't implement it, and he just runs him right over. And that's the kind of unexpected thing. I told you the police officer one. The police officer, the guy in front of the police officer, slammed on his brakes. Police officer did. The guy on cannabis went right through the police car. So it's very sad, and people need, I am not a prude. I like my champagne.
Yeah.
I don't drink and drive. If you want to stay home and you want to smoke cannabis and not expose children to it, that's your own business, but you have no right to make that decision and go out and put other people at risk.
And let me add to that. I don't think you should expose anybody to your cannabis, be it children, be it a neighbor smoking on your back porch and it drifting into their yard, using cannabis in an apartment building and it seeps through the doors and the windows and gets into other people's apartments. There's many ways you could get exposure. And you're very right. Does it surprise you a lot that they're pushing so hard to get this legalized across our country?
No, it's huge business. It's $1 billion business.
Right.
I do want to say one thing too. I am strongly in support of medical cannabis for unmet clinical needs where we have proven its safety and, the most important thing, proven its efficacy. So we have some cannabis products now that come from the cannabis plant, like Epidiolex,
Right.
which has made life-changing differences in children with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. It's made a tremendous difference. But we've done all of the studies. It's approved by the FDA, and we know that it works. We also have dronabinol for helping people with AIDS wasting disease and nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy. But what we have now is we have rampant use, quote, medical use of cannabis without any studies showing its efficacy. And the other thing we have not done in this country is we have not addressed the issue of medical cannabis and driving.
Yes,
I mean, we just haven't addressed it.
We have not.
And we need to. We need to have a plan, whether people who use medical cannabis can't drive at all,
right?
Or whether we do the testing to show that certain doses and with certain levels of tolerance can drive acceptably. But we have not addressed it, and it's a very bad problem.
And when they go into these medical dispensaries, they're greeted there by someone called a bud tender, who in most cases, from what I've heard, I've never gone into one, I've never spoken to one, but from what I've heard, and also from a person that used to do that job, We've heard that these people are nothing but potheads and things, and they've tried these different things, and people go in there with a medical condition. I mean, I know a woman lately whose son went in there, and he had a digestive issue, and he heard that cannabis would help him, and they prescribed this particular thing, and his condition got much worse until he ended up taking his own life. He couldn't handle it anymore. He was promised this as a cure, and it didn't work out, and he just gave up. And we need to address these issues and understand. I think these people put a lot of faith into these bud tenders when they go into these dispensaries, these medical
and
dispensaries.
They are not medical personnel.
Right.
They do not have the training to do this. And, in Israel, I do a lot of research in Israel. And in Israel, they're one of the first countries to have medical cannabis. And it was set up. You would go see your doctor. Your doctor would suggest what to use. You would take the prescription. You would go to a dispensary and you would get it. And the plan was you would go back to your doctor and you would discuss, did it work? Did it not work? What should I do? Well, what they found is they never came back to the doctor. That the person without the medical training is saying, oh, increase your dose, change this. And so they actually totally revamped their system. And now medical cannabis is given out through pharmacists, just like every other kind of medicine. Mm-hmm. And you have to have changes in that prescription from your physician. Mm-hmm. And I think those would be very positive changes.
Right. Something else I wanted to ask you about that I didn't bring up before was perhaps edibles and driving. I know it's a whole different way of looking at it because it takes a while to digest these things, right?
Yes. In fact, with inhalation, any type of inhalation, you actually have the peak concentration before the last puff, whether you're smoking or using a vaporizer. So you get very, very high peaks really quickly. It drops off really quickly in the blood, not in the brain, but in the blood. And the effects, like many effects, come back to normal in, say, something like heart rate is back to normal within about 3 or 4 hours. With edibles, you take it in and the peak is very variable between 1 and 5 hours. So it really can peak later.
1 to 5 hours.
Yes, wow. It's much longer. And the THC concentrations are much, much lower. Okay. Because it's absorbed much slower and a lot of it's destroyed. So you put it in the acid stomach and a lot gets destroyed. You then take it from the stomach right to the liver where it starts to get metabolized. So when you smoke cannabis, you get high concentrations very rapidly. And you have very low concentrations at the peak THC of 11-hydroxy. 11-hydroxy THC is the first metabolite, and it is just as potent as THC. So it's important for laboratories to measure, but after smoking, initially, concentrations are pretty low. After edibles, you produce about the same amount of 11-hydroxy as you do THC. And since they're equipotent, it's almost like a doubling of the amount. You need to take into account the THC and the 11-hydroxy concentrations. The other thing is that effects last much longer. So let's say you have an offset after smoking cannabis, in most regards after, the acute effects in 6 hours, 8 hours. But with the edibles, it can go out 12 hours or so. So it's very important to understand the effects may last a lot longer. And then for a reason we do not know yet, there appears to be more psychosis with edibles. And I do not have a scientific answer for it. But when we had people, both occasional cannabis users, chronic frequent cannabis users, smoked cannabis, vaped cannabis, and edibles, all at the same dose, we had a lot more psychosis. When the same person, same dose, took it by edible than when they smoked it. So that's another issue. And you hear about this all the time in Colorado because people will come out to Colorado. They want to do cannabis tourism. They don't like smoking, so they decide I'll take a cookie. They get a cookie. It's just one little cookie. They don't read on the bottom that it's 100 milligrams of THC. It says break into 10 even pieces. Who does that? You can't break it into 10 even pieces. And I don't share my cookies with anybody. So they eat a whole cookie. And guess what? Nothing happens. So they take the second cookie and they eat it. And then 2, 3, 4 hours later, boom. And they're afraid. They don't like the loss of control. They don't like their heart rate that's going so fast. And so they end up in the emergency room.
Wow. So many things that people need to be warned about, when they make it like it's just this fun thing and it's just something that you can go and do. Nobody warns you about any of these things that you've just discussed with us. And that's really scary. And as long as I've been doing this, some of the things that you've told me, I've never heard of before. So it's so important that we get these messages out there. And a campaign that we're doing is for Halloween about candy and how much they make these products look like the real thing, like Pop-Tarts instead of Pop-Tarts and Reese's. They change all these just a little bit, and a child isn't going to truly examine it if somebody has put this in their candy bag,
Wait, exactly. And also another thing a very serious thing that people need to be aware of is, that we're in the middle of this horrible opioid epidemic where many, many people have died. And we have these very potent synthetic opioids. Do you know that they're putting those synthetic opioids not only in heroin, not only in oxycodone pills, they're putting it in cocaine, they're putting it in marijuana, and they're lacing it. And people are dying from these things. So people have to be extremely careful.
Yes, definitely. Wow. I'm always learning something new. I'm always amazed at the fact that we're putting this out there and we're not warning people, and there's no warning signs about driving in a lot of these dispensaries. I mean, it should be right on the product. It amazes me that they go to a different doctor who actually knows them. At least that is how it is in my state. There's a different doctor that you go to get your marijuana card. So the man really doesn't, the doctor, I shouldn't say man, the doctor really does not know your background or how this drug could affect you, and it's recommended to you, and then you go into these dispensaries and you buy this powerful marijuana, and from what I hear, it's very powerful nowadays. Like you said, it can be up to, there was 100 milligrams. Is it milligrams? Am I saying that correct? Of THC within that cookie. And like you said, cookie, you always eat the whole cookie. Who doesn't? And, you could eat that cookie as you walk outside of the dispensary and get in your car. And a half hour later, an hour later, you're totally out of it. So we've got a lot of work to do, if you ask me.
And I think with, the government is really, it takes some horrible event to really draw attention. And we don't want that. We don't want any more deaths. We want people to understand and be responsible with their use. Driving is not, it's something you have to, it's not a right. You have to earn it. And you cannot you drink and drive, and you cannot use cannabis and drive because you put yourself and others at risk.
And it's insidious. So you can't be objective with yourself once you are already on these drugs. You're not gonna make the proper decision because you're not thinking through a clear mind. So,
well, the surveys show that a very large percentage of adolescents say that they smoke and drive. In the last year, a very large percentage smoked and drive.
They just did that. They did that survey. I think it was in Michigan where I think it was 51% of marijuana users medical marijuana users drive very high. And that's only the people that admit to it. So the actual statistic, I'm sure, is much higher than that. Well, thank you so much. Yes.
One more thing I want to make sure we don't forget is the most common combination is alcohol and cannabis. And in that study that we did in the most advanced driving simulator, we showed that alcohol alone impairs driving, cannabis alone impairs driving, and together it's an additive impairment. So it is very, very dangerous to both use alcohol and cannabis. And we showed that when someone uses both, that the cannabis causes the peak alcohol to be delayed. So, people know a lot about, well, if I drink, I need to wait this long, etc.
Yes.
The cannabis can delay that peak. And the alcohol caused a significantly higher THC concentration. Wow. And we think that's because alcohol causes capillaries to dilate. And in the lung, the capillaries in the lung may dilate and take in more THC. So that is also a very dangerous combination.
So definitely an intensifying effect when you add the two together. Wow. Yes. Interesting. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's just been incredible speaking with you, and I hope that we can talk to you again on some other subjects that we'll be covering soon.
Yes, and again, I'm very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you are doing. I know she'd be very, very proud of you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Eustis. I really appreciate that. I try to do her justice. Thank you. We ask you to like and share our podcast and give us good reviews so that we can increase awareness about marijuana-impaired driving. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please share it with your friends and family and follow us for more important information on marijuana. Thank you.